Traveling through the Northern Song Dynasty, he became the legitimate second son of Emperor Huizong who should have died young. Zhao Xi stated that there is a lot of pressure. To the north lies the Liao and Jin dynasties, to the west lies the Xia tribes, to the south lies Dali, to the east lies Goryeo, and the Tatars are even more restless. Above the court, decaying wood was appointed as an official, and among the court and the emperor, beasts fed on wealth, and those who acted recklessly were all dominating the court. Those who were subservient were all in power. Zhao Xi was thoughtful and focused on dealing with the upcoming Jinkong incident, with the same party and opposing differences. But suddenly one day, an old and toothless former captain surnamed Hong came to find him and said that decades ago, he had once let a pit of demons roam in Longhu Mountain. Under Zhao Xi's shock, the black man suddenly had a question mark on his face. I've been working hard for 16 years, but you actually told me this is water margin. Keywords of the novel. The Great Song Dynasty pondered for 16 years, only then did it know that there was no pop-up window in the water margin. The Great Song Dynasty pondered for 16 years, only then did it know that it was the complete collection download of the water margin. The Great Song Dynasty pondered for 16 years, only then did it know that it was the latest chapter reading in the water margin. Chapter 1. Tokyo Fenghua. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1. Tokyo Fenghua. During the Zhenghe period of the Great Song Dynasty. It's a blooming early spring. On the East Gate Street of Daxiangguo Temple, shops selling fur hats, belts, books, and crown decorations on both sides have placed their goods outside the door. The young men in the shop stand by the stalls and shout a few times when they have free time. Then, out of 10, 9 of them are seduced by the glamorous little girls who are dressed up, and they flee back to the shop under the loud scolding of the shopkeeper. Dingjiasu Tea Shop is a well-known brand in Tokyo. During the 5-day opening hours of the Daisengoku Temple every month, the business is booming as if it were cooking oil. There are also elderly storytellers in the shop, with their granddaughter wearing red clothes and braids tied in sheep horns, talking about a strange story of General Nirvana's night attack on Kunlun Pass. The best position in the front row is a hardwood folding chair painted with tung oil, leaning against a young man. The young man is wearing a white jade-inlaid gold crown and a silver cloak with round flowers. His lips are red and his teeth are white, and he is incredibly handsome. However, at this moment, he is very lazy and doesn't have much sitting posture. After a while of reading, he lazily lazes up, says, "Reward," and stands up to walk outside the door. The young man had several followers, and a square-faced man with an expressionless face arranged copper coins on the old man's table. He turned a deaf ear to the grateful words of his grandparents and grandchildren, and chased the young man out of the door. The young man stood on the street, looking around. The crowd was bustling, the flowers were all over the road, and it was beautiful and lush. Luo Qi was fragrant, and his heart was calm. Suddenly, he chuckled and walked towards the east gate of the Daxiangguo Temple with both hands on his back. "Xiaoxianggang, why don't you go to the main entrance?" The man with a square face had already followed and half bent his originally tiger-backed and bare waist, respectfully asking. The young man continued to walk slowly, watching as he walked, and after a while, he said, look everywhere. This prosperous era is so beautiful, and if you don't look again, you're afraid you won't be able to see it in the future." The man reached out and scratched his head. Although he was a military official, he was also literate and could write several poems with loose rhymes and incomplete rhymes. However, for some reason, he often couldn't understand the words of Xiao Xianggong. The competition from all directions brings together the treasures of the 4 seas and the peculiar smell of the world. It is truly prosperous. The young man smiled and the topic suddenly changed. "I don't know where Zhang Zedwan's Qingming River painting went, but his brushwork is very exquisite. When you go back, ask him to take a closer look." "What Xiaoxianggang said is absolutely right," the man with a square face quickly agreed. At this moment, the flow of people on Dongmen Street is endless. Even though the street vendors shout hoarse, they cannot hide their joy on their faces. They touch the hard currency in their forks and think about buying 2 liang of water powder for the little widow on the wall after closing the stall. As for their own mother-in-law, they can save it. On the road, a big man in cloth clothes, holding a bamboo dragonfly and a willow leaf in his mouth, spun and looked left and right, sniffing the aroma before coming to the side of a single little girl. He blushed and chatted with AI, even if he had been turned off. It wasn't until Chongqua paid for her that he realized the wallet was missing. He then panicked and jumped around to search for the thief, but the little girl covered her mouth with a handkerchief and walked away with a smile. The officials and women of the wealthy family were in small groups, carrying slaves and servants. The officials specially placed flowers in their ears, straightened their backs, and had agile eyes. They looked around in the crowd, secretly thinking that Yen was thin and fat. Even if the woman twisted her waist hard, she still didn't know the pain. The young man didn't walk fast, so he came to the east gate of Xianghua Temple and looked for a moment before slowly walking in. The temple is extremely vast, with numerous stalls and a large number of visitors. Various items are displayed, making visitors dizzy. Those from other places who come to admire it are even more amazed. As the young man walked and watched, he unconsciously crossed the second door, which was even more exciting. The items he sold were all from Tokyo's time-honored brands, such as the Meng family's Taoist crown, Wang Doran's candied fruit, Zhao Wenxiu's pen, Pan Gu's ink ingot, and the corridors on both sides were adorned with embroidery, eyebrows, velvet flowers, headgear, and novel ornaments inlaid with gold threads and colorful silk. The young man did not enter the Buddhist temple, so he bought a lotus bag with a water blue background embroidered with a pelican and walked leisurely towards the back of the temple. On the side of the Zixing gate behind the main hall, there were bookstalls, calligraphy and paintings, various rare toys, and some not-so-authentic spices, exaggerating the vintage of old medicine. The local products between different prefectures were not considered first-class. The young man shook his head when he saw them. He picked and bought a few more items, then crossed over the fortune-telling and divination stalls on both sides and the table for drawing portraits, and continued walking with the flow of people. The young man seemed to be in a good mood. Although he kept walking and stopping, he was not bored at all. The next moment, he passed through Zen temples such as Jihai, Huilin, Baofan, and Hesha, circling in a small circle and still exiting through the east gate. At this moment, the man with a square face respectfully said, "Is Zhao Xi not fully enjoying himself?" The young man looked at him with a smile on his face and said, "What kind of rhetoric does Vice Minister Tan have?" The man with a square face crossed his hand and said, "Zhao Xi, today is the 28th, which is the birthday of Dongyue Renxing Grandpa. I think the Yu Temple is also bustling, but just walking over will inevitably tire Zhao Xiang's waist." The young man said, "But it's not a big deal. I'm a bit tired of sedans and horses today. Besides, after passing through Panlu East Street, I'll be at the Swansemen." The square-faced man quickly said, "Yes." The young man's mouth slightly curled up and said, "I heard that Vice Minister Tan is proficient in both literature and ink, and his fists and feet are very good. However, he has been wronged by the Imperial City Department. Now that the Imperial City Department cannot compare to the reign of Emperor Huizong, who can offend the current full court of civil and military officials." The man with a square face chuckled twice and bowed, saying, "What Zhao Xiang said is absolutely true. My ancestors have been working in the Imperial Army for a long time, and it was not until this generation had no achievements that I was drafted to the Imperial City Department. I have been enduring hardship until now." The young man smiled and said, "Now that the envoys of the Imperial City have all become high-ranking officials, there is still a position of colluding with the Imperial City Department, but it's okay not to do it. Since you have followed the path of Tong Shumi and planned to bow under my door, but have you already made up your mind?" The man with a square face lowered his eyebrows and eyes and said, it's all up to the little prime minister's orders. His loyalty is unparalleled, and the sun and moon can serve as a guide. The young man looked at him and said, before it's too early, go to Panlu Street for a meal, and then head to Yuemiao. A group of people left Daxiangguo Temple and headed north, passing by Panlu Street. After eating and drinking, they soon arrived near the Yu Temple. The Yu Temple in Tokyo is more called Mount Taishan Temple by the people. During the reign of Emperor Huizong Xiangfu, Mount Taishan God was granted the title of Holy King of Dongyue Tianqi Ren, and later was given the title of Holy Emperor of Dongyue Tianqi Ren. This temple was built at that time. Although the Yu Temple is not as lively as the Daxiangguo Temple, it is still bustling at this moment. As the young man walked and looked, he soon came to the vicinity of the 5 Yu Tower. The young man suddenly said, "Why is there so much noise ahead?" The man with a square face fixed his gaze and saw several people standing on the railing downstairs, each holding slingshots, blowpipes, and sticky sticks, frowning and winking. In the middle stood a young man in a floral robe, with a crooked crown and hat, flower arrangements in his ear, and an open collar, blocking a woman's way and jokingly saying, "Young lady, go upstairs now. I want to talk to Hello Sheng." The woman seems to be not over 20 years old, but her hair is tied in a bun. Her eyebrows are as delicate as a painting, her eyes are like spring water, her cheong nose and sandalwood mouth, her pointed chin, and her soft and graceful figure are delicate. At this moment, she is already Xia Fei's cheeks, saying, "In a peaceful world, what is the reason to tease a good person?" The man with a square face saw it very clearly and turned around in a low voice, saying, "Xiao Xianggong, is the son of Gao Qiu, named Gao Can, also known as Gao Shirda. He is usually very mischievous and likes to tease and insult women from good families. The people in the city call him Gao Yinmei." The young man narrowed his eyes slightly upon hearing this and said, "Gao Qiu has 3 family members, why do you accept this?" The square-faced man was taken aback and said, "Well, I don't know." The young man said again, "The official family will reorganize the 2 departments and 3 yamen, reset the imperial guards and the military department, and order me to propose a separation of powers from the palace front department under the leadership of Gao Qiu. Currently, the department has not been established, and after the Ministry of Revenue allocates the government office, it is necessary to repeat some matters related to the palace front department. Gao Qiu may have some complaints about this." The man with a square face sneered, "The family matters on both sides are Xiaoxiangang. How dare that guy complain? Although the 2 departments and 3 yamen have similar responsibilities, Xiaoxiangang must be the main one at this time." The young man smiled slightly and said, "In the 3rd year of Emperor Taizu's Jianlong reign, after Duke Shi Shoshin of the state of Wei resigned as the commander of the Imperial Guards no longer had a leader and were only managed by Marquis Duyu. In the 2nd year of the Jingde reign, Duke Wang Chao of the state of Lu was dismissed from his position as Marquis Duyu, and there were no more successors. As a result, the Imperial Guards, and the infantry were divided into 2 parts. From then on, the Ma and infantry armies were placed under the front of the palace." The man with a square face scratched his head and said, "Little Xianggong is knowledgeable, and I admire him." The young man shook his head and said, "Now that the official family has reset the command of the Imperial Guard and the military department, I am in charge of both the Ma Bu and the yamen. However, I have turned the tables on the front of the palace department. It is impossible for Gao Qiu to have no resentment in his heart." The man with a square face said, "Little Xianggong, why bother? If that guy doesn't agree, just find a way to beat him." The young man's mouth curved and suddenly looked forward, saying, "But it's a bit out of place." The square-faced man followed the young man's gaze, only to see that the eyes of the high office were shining, and his mouth was whispering in a chaotic tone, talking and tugging. Although the woman was hiding and dodging, she was still a weak and inexperienced woman. How could she be surrounded by these naughty and idle men? Her face showed a look of fear, and she was about to cry on the spot. Xiaoxiangang, I want my subordinates to go. A fierce expression flashed on the man's face, and several attendants and guards behind the young man also took a step forward. The young man pondered for a while, nodded, and the square-faced man couldn't help but let go of his voice and shouted, that splashing talent is really audacious. In a peaceful and prosperous era, it is clear and magnificent. How dare you tease a good woman like this? He shouted loudly, which immediately startled the group of idle people to look over. However, Goryeo was mesmerized and didn't turn his head, only cursing, where did you come from? You dare to interfere with grandpa's affairs, go and beat this scumbag for me. Upon hearing this, the young man's eyebrows furrowed slightly, and the square-faced man caught this change. His expression suddenly changed, revealing a hint of ferocity. He reached out and pulled out a rare soft sword from his waist. With a slight thrust, the sword's body became straight, and he was about to step forward. Unexpectedly, at this moment, a person was interspersed in the diagonal thrust. The new book has been released, and we hope that both old and new readers can support us. Thank you very much for the purple color. End of this chapter. Chapter 2. There are always injustices in the world. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2. There are always injustices in the world, but I saw this person passing by, wearing a light veil and a corner-grabbing headscarf, with 2 white jade rings and bead-like sideburns at the back of the head, wearing a green luo large floral robe, tied with a silver patchwork belt, with a leopard head and eyes, a swallow's chin and tiger whiskers, and a burly figure. The square-faced man frowned and said to himself, isn't this little lady's family? I saw this person rushing towards me, flipping the shoulder of the high yaman and shouting, in a peaceful world, what crime should I commit to flirting with women from good families? He was about to punch, but he saw the face of this tall yaman. There was a nickname for Hua Hua Tai Sui in this yaman, who was extremely ugly and easy to recognize. This person recognized it as a member of the Gao Yaman, and surprisingly, his hand softened by 9 points. He raised his fist there, neither hitting nor falling, but his face was filled with anger, and he looked at the Yaman with open eyes. The square-faced man saw the little girl who had been teased running behind him and grabbing her by the corner of her clothes, which confirmed his conjecture. He couldn't help but shake his head and said, but it's just a soft-footed crab. My own wife has been teased and can only show off and not be considered a hero. He was about to break out just now and was blocked by this person. He was already angry in his heart, afraid of leaving a bad impression in front of the young man. But now he saw that this person was cowardly, so he naturally became angry and pointed at Goryeo, cursing, you bastard, you dare to speak disrespectfully. You really want to die. The yaman was slapped on the shoulder by someone. Just as he was about to say something, he suddenly heard the words of the man with a square face and became furious. He turned around and commanded a circle of idle rascals, saying, why don't you fight this thief-fighting bird for me? A group of idle men may have belongings in their hands, but most of them are sticks. There is a law in Tokyo that prohibits the private storage of weapons. Even if idle men have weapons in their homes, even if it is just a simple knife that cannot be enlisted, they dare not openly bring them to places like your temple. At this moment, although it was a stick, there were many idle men, and they surrounded with a whistle. The square-faced man shook his sword slightly, and the soft sword buzzed. The idle men had never seen such a thing, let alone knew its strength. Some reckless people swung their sticks at the square-faced man. The square-faced man had a sinister expression on his face. He took a step forward and pulled out a sword flower in his hand. With a flash of silver light, the idle man let out a loud cry, threw his stick, and fell backwards with a thud. Everyone went to take a look, and the idle man covered his face with both hands, blood seeping out from his fingers, and his mouth still yelling, killed, killed. Among these idle people, there was also the fierce and combative one. 3 or 5 exchanged glances and were about to besiege and advance. However, at this moment, 5 or 6 attendants and guards beside the young man heard the clanging sound of gold and iron inside their clothes. Everyone surprisingly had hidden knives inside their clothes. At this moment, the knives came out of their sheaths, and the snowy blade, under the sunlight, made these mischievous and idle men's faces turn pale. In the yamen, things are not going well. These people have weapons from the army. The knowledgeable idle man immediately let out a strange cry and dragged his stick backwards, like a wild cat with its tail stepped on, running towards Gao Yamen. Weapons in the military. Gao Yanniai suddenly widened his eyes, and even the person next to him was stunned and looked forward. Daring to wear and use standard weapons, and not just one person, is definitely not an ordinary person. However, seeing this scene in the yamen not only did not panic, but also jumped up and cursed, "Which army do you belong to? Don't you recognize me in the yamen?" The man with a square face peeked at the young man, only to see that there was no trace of expression on his face. He couldn't help but grit his teeth in secret. Since he had entrusted all the connections in his family, he had taken the path of Tong Shumi to come to the door of the little Xiangong, and was destined to have no other way out. At present, he could only submit his name and make a statement. Even if the Grand Commandant Gao Qiu was in front, he dared to stab him with a sword. Quickly walking forward, there were a few people among those idle people who came to stop them, but they were not loyal people. They were just not very clever and had foolish ideas of flattering and inviting credit. Before the square-faced man could take action, the guards with swords rushed forward and beat the ignorant idle men to the ground, crying and calling out for their mothers. What does the thief-servant bird want to do? Seeing that the situation was not right, Gao Ye quickly reached out his hand and took a small step back from his clothes. Although his expression was panicked, he shouted fiercely, "My father is Gao Taiwei of the palace commander's mansion, and you are members of the Forbidden Army. If I were rude to the Ye, wouldn't it be like seeking my own death?" The square-faced man chuckled and said, "It's just impolite, so what should we do?" As soon as he spoke these words, the onlookers exclaimed, "How many people in the streets of Tokyo dare to speak like this? Who is that Gao Qiu? He was the commanding officer of the palace in front of this dynasty, commonly known as the palace commander of the palace, with the rank of Grand Commandant, almost the ultimate military officer." Although this dynasty prioritized literature over martial arts, it was also relatively important for Li Shu. Both civil and military officials were considered officials by the common people, let alone the Grand Commandant in charge of the Forbidden Army. "You are not the Forbidden Army." Gao Yanniai was not foolish. He realized that the other party did not care about his identity, so he secretly said, "It's not right. Where can the Forbidden Army be afraid of Gao Qiu? The person who just slapped him on the shoulder is the leader of the Forbidden Army. They have seen each other and today they flirted with his wife. Now they are standing dumbfounded and dare not even say a harsh word." The bean eyes in Gao Ye turned, thinking in his mind, besides the Forbidden Army, which other official dared to openly wield knives and guns and open the Kaifeng prefecture? Not like, Ministry of War. Impossible, where else is there at this moment? The man with a square face was eager to devote himself, and there was no room for this yamen to ponder. His body seemed to move forward like a gust of wind, and he then slapped him hard in the face. "Oh my!" Gao Yanniai screamed in agony, reaching out to cover his cheeks. A stream of blood foam seeped out from the corner of his mouth, and he shouted recklessly, "Dare to hit your grandfather? You bandits join the army, you're tired of living and you're looking for death." The coachman on the side suddenly turned pale upon seeing this situation, and immediately pulled his wife to hide to the side. He clenched his fists tightly, his knuckles protruding and trembling slightly, not knowing what was on his mind. On the contrary, the little lady's fear on her face had faded a bit, and her teary eyes were slightly dazed. Although she grabbed the corner of the coachman's clothes, she stumbled when the man tried to avoid her, feeling a bit at a loss. The square-faced man had a sinister smile on his face and reached out to slap him again. He said fiercely, you can also scare a certain family. Captain Gao can't control a certain family, but it's you in the yamen who dare to act recklessly after committing such a bad thing. I don't know who's using your dog power. Ah. Gao Yanniai covered his cheeks and suddenly spat out a mouthful. It turned out that several bad teeth were mixed with minced meat, indicating that the man with a square face had dealt a heavy blow. Even the nature of being a scoundrel in the yamen was painful, causing the ground to roll and cry out to those idle men with tears and noses, hurry up and deliver a letter to my father. Just say there are bandits on the mountain who have infiltrated the city and are trying to harm our yamen. Upon hearing this, the man with a square face pointed his soft sword at the Gao yamen and gave a gloomy smile, saying, you dirty and filthy person. I'm from the Imperial City Department, and even Captain Gao can't control me. End of this chapter. Chapter 3. King of Qi. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3. King of Qi. Imperial City Department. Although the current Imperial City Department may not have the same glory as a few years ago, it still has some remaining power. As soon as the square-faced man said this, the scene fell silent. The coach's face became increasingly pale, and he pulled his wife back a few more steps. Even the mischievous ones remained silent. The one with that clever mind was already oiling their feet and sliding back. Upon hearing this, Gao Yanniai was stunned. He knew the Imperial City Department, but the Imperial City Department was not afraid of him, and he may not have been afraid of the Imperial City Department. After all, what he did was not the responsibility of the Imperial City Department. Thinking of this, his temper flared up again and he immediately shouted like a pig, so what about the Imperial City Department? Even if we make mistakes in our office, we will have Kaifeng Prefecture to speak. When will it be the Imperial City Department's turn to abuse lynching? Not to mention that we haven't made any mistakes in our office, I will sue you. Although both sides of his face were swollen and his mouth was hurting like a needle prick at the moment, his thoughts were still vivid. Since the young lady is the leader's woman, how dare she say that her own family is not? As for the onlookers, they were just watching the commotion. Unexpectedly, no one dared to prove that he had molested the women of the people. This could also frame the charge of the Imperial City Minister being arrogant and beating people on the street. Who are you going to sue? At this moment, a voice rang out, very gentle at first, but with a slight refinement. It was like a knife in the cold wind. I'm suing someone, you say I'm suing someone. Gao Yanniai felt this way at the moment, and his voice made him feel very uncomfortable. He immediately raised his tone and said, Thief's Army. I want to sue your Imperial City Bureau. Pop. The man with a square face kicked over, rolling like a gourd and crashing onto the edge of the steps in the yamen. He immediately exclaimed, his head full of all kinds of meat and vegetables, but he was a scoundrel and mischievous. How could he easily beg for mercy, but his neck was stiff. Those who didn't believe in the Imperial City Department dared to take serious action. As long as he suffered this, Gao Qiu would speak for him and make the decision. Speaking wildly, I see you're really looking for death. The square-faced man was so angry that his short beard trembled. He didn't expect this yamen to have the virtue of being a rolling knife meat. After eating several times, his teeth fell out, but his mouth was still so hard. The gentle voice rang out again, who is the bandit army? For some reason, when the yamen heard this sound, he felt a little flustered for no reason. He pinched his thigh fiercely, calmed down, and looked up to see a young man. The young man in his golden robe was unparalleled in beauty, with a faint smile on his face, staring at him with a good eye. The yamen was taken aback for a moment, and in just a few seconds, the swollen and red face suddenly turned white. Unconsciously, it shuddered greatly. The next moment it simply plopped and knelt down on the ground, with a hint of crying in its mouth. It trembled and shouted, "Tu. What tu?" The young man chuckled and slowly said, "Do you recognize me? Second King, spare your life." The yamen lay on the ground, covered in cold sweat. He was so scared at this moment that he wouldn't beg for mercy. It was just a bold boast. The young man narrowed his narrow and beautiful eyes and said, "How did you recognize this king? The villain is Gao Qiu's son." Last year, he had seen the second prince from afar. However, the inside of the yamen was really flustered. How could they not have imagined that they would meet the current second prince here? This is not a good person, it's better to hold on to justice. Two kings, forgive me, I didn't see the two kings just now. I deserve to die 1,000 times. The yamen lay on the ground, banging its head on the ground. Even though it was mostly for worship and not for kowtowing, it still hit the forehead with blood and refused to stop. The young man looked at the yamen and said, "Is your father Gao Qiu?" "It's Gao Qiu, who knows how to kick gas balls." The official kowtowed like pounding garlic. The young man no longer spoke, but turned his gaze to the coach and the young lady beside him. The instructor had heard the conversation just now and his expression kept changing. He saw the young man looking over and suddenly bowing to the ground, wanting to speak, but found that his wife was still standing in a daze, anxious and angry. He reached out to pull, but the little lady didn't know what was wrong, not even bowing, and was pulled to the point of, "Oh. No need," the boy said gently, realizing the coach's intentions. The instructor was a bit flustered and spoke up to the two kings, wanting to say something more, but saw the young man turn his face to his own wife. "Lift your head," the young man said. The young lady was indeed a bit panicked upon hearing this, and quickly looked at the instructor. However, to her surprise, the instructor didn't know what was on his mind at this moment. He just lowered his head and couldn't help but feel more aggrieved in his heart. He raised his eyebrows and eyes, bit his lips lightly, and looked straight at the young man. The young man looked at it again and again, caressing his hands and saying with a smile, "It's really beautiful, not inferior to everyone. Seeing it really brings joy to people." The little lady was both shy and angry, but now she was even more hesitant to speak. She didn't know the Chinese characters, and although she didn't come from a scholarly background, she was also someone with a family background. Just now, it was saved that the famous Hua Tai Sui in the yamen almost fainted. He could still make a few righteous remarks about this villain's teasing words, but unexpectedly, another two great kings came. Although they spoke gently, they didn't seem like good words, but they always helped her out and couldn't offend anything more. So the little lady lowered her head again, looked at the tip of her embroidered shoes, and remained silent. The young man smiled and looked at the yamen with both hands on his back. The yamen was still banging his head hard. The young man closed his eyes for a few breaths and said, "Does it hurt?" The yamen hurriedly agreed, "If the two kings say it hurts, it hurts. If they say it doesn't hurt, it doesn't hurt." The young man said, "It's better to hurt than to lose, but is that the truth? What the two kings said is so true, so true." The yamen was so painful that he almost cried, but could only exert more force. He dared not slander the young man in his heart, but greeted all the ancestors of the square-faced man's 18 generations. Then there was the leader who had already been stabbed several times in his heart. The young man let out a light sigh and caught a glimpse of the instructor's lips moving, seeming to want to say something, but his face turned red and he never opened his mouth. He didn't care in his heart either. No matter what kind of straightness this person's behavior was before, everyone had their own concerns. However, the young man always felt that this scene seemed familiar, yet it seemed to have no source. A strange feeling arose, and he couldn't help but raise his eyebrows, feeling a slight tightness in his chest. At this moment, the coach's cracked lips trembled. Perhaps he had made some decision to speak to the young man, but the man with a square face came to his side and whispered, "Young master, this." The young man glanced at him with a faint impatience on his face, and the square-faced man immediately said, "I understand." The instructor took a deep breath and wanted to speak again, but saw the man with a square face quickly walk to the side of the yamen and kick him. The yamen suddenly let out a miserable cry, and one leg had already been kicked off by Sheng, causing him to scream a few times in pain before fainting. The man with a square face snorted. Tan Zheneng, as a martial arts official, sat on the position of deputy envoy of the Imperial City Department, which could only be appointed by eunuchs and eunuchs. He knew how to handle current affairs. The young man nodded upon seeing the situation and smiled slightly at the people around him, saying, "I am Zhao Xi, honored as the king of Qi. I will now give some punishment to those who have done evil in the government office as a warning. If this happens again, everyone can go to the Kaifeng government office to file a lawsuit and mention my name." Upon hearing these words, the people all showed a joyful expression and crossed their hands to shout out the two great kings of the 1,000-year-old. It was evident that in this Tokyo city, the two characters Qi Wang had a considerable reputation and prestige. Zhao Xi turned around, and the guards of Yulongji put their swords into their sheaths. Tan Zhen spat fiercely at the yamen still on the ground, shouting in agony. He then looked at the instructor who was still bowing to the ground, but with a disappointed expression on his face, he let out a sigh and followed Zhao Xi out of the Yu temple. End of this chapter. Chapter 4. Gathering 8 Directions. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4. Gathering 8 Directions. The carved beams and painted rafters in the palace of King Qi are resplendent and prosperous. At this moment it was not yet late at night, and the jade rabbit was still frosty white. Zhao Xi sat on the middle hall chair, his eyes slightly closed, holding a cup of drink in his hand, slowly drinking it with a thin tube of thick craft paper. The strange feeling in his heart once again arose. This is not the first time I have felt this kind of feeling. I have experienced it several times since he crossed over, but I always can't figure it out. Originally, the second son of Emperor Daojun of this dynasty passed away early, on the second day of his birth, and it was at this time that he crossed into his infancy. I had originally planned to compete for the position of 95, and then worked hard to become a ruler of rejuvenation. However, after calculating my years, I suddenly realized that it was too late. Even if I succeeded, if it continued according to normal times, before he could take over the throne and take control, the Jurchen had already gone south to destroy this colorful world. And at this moment, the situation of this dynasty is not much stronger than that of the end of the Ming dynasty. The appearance is prosperous, but the inside is withered and the outside is exhausted. The emphasis is on literature and light on martial arts, and the tale is not big enough. Judging from the chaos of the 5 dynasties and the Chen Bridge incident, it has been overcorrected. The Jino area is incomplete, and there is nothing to do in the court. The people's grievances are deep, and the officials are like jackals. The foundation of the country is shaken, and they are unsustainable. Those who live in a daze are called Qingming. It has already rotted from the root. What else can we do about this? Don't say you don't have time to wait until you come to power and strive for excellence. Even if one day comes, it may become even worse. Even scraping bones and treating poison is just drinking poison to quench thirst. There is no choice but to smash an old world and save the country with weapons and knives. However, Zhao Xi was puzzled by the strange feeling in his heart at the moment. Since his time traveling, Wen Ku has remained unforgettable, while Wu Zhe is versatile. However, this strange feeling in his heart has always been missing somewhere. "Prince, there is a letter." Walking into the door, Ming Qinsui called out to Lei San. "I didn't say that now that I am in court, it's better to call myself the little prime minister," Zhao Xi said, putting down his drink. Lei San awkwardly smiled and approached to present the item. It was personally delivered by Mr. Mi. Zhao Xi took the letter and quickly read it, but it was not a big deal. It was just that the imperial city minister, Mi Zhenting, had an old friend who also lived in a temple and had the title of Grand Commandant. However, during the decades after he became an official, his children were incompetent, and in the end, his family was in decline, to the point where life was difficult to sustain. Therefore, he brought his most promising descendants to join him, and this Mi Gonggang recommended his connections. After reading it, Zhao Xi couldn't help but smile. Mi Gonggong was not considered a high-ranking official in the inner court, and the imperial city commissioner, who was originally of low rank, was falsely appointed by the imperial city commissioner as a non-official. However, in the inner court, no one was willing to provoke him, and several influential eunuchs were no exception. The reason behind it is that this Duke Mi was really capable of living. He had been serving in the palace since the reign of Emperor Huizong and has now gone through 5 dynasties. During the reign of Emperor Huizong, he also served as a provincial eunuch and was in charge of all eunuch attendants. Later, as he grew older, he refused to leave the palace. In this dynasty, after Emperor Daojun ascended to the throne, he remembered his difficulties and was granted a vacant position, thus raising his old age. However, to be honest, Zhao Xi couldn't quite understand this Duke Mi. Other eunuchs who gained power, such as Yang Jian and Li Yan, tried their best to obtain gold, silver, and wealth, and then purchased industrial land outside, cleverly taking and plundering everything to the extreme. But this father-in-law neither buys property nor buys land, perhaps. Why not have money? Zhao Xi pondered, not having heard of this father-in-law getting involved in the affairs of the court. If he didn't get involved, why did he bring in a lot of gold and silver? The old captain with a declining family background mentioned in the letter was an official during the reign of Emperor Huizong and an official during the reign of Emperor Huizong. The political order during that time was relatively clear, so it is possible that he did not leave much room for support, and even today he has gone bankrupt. If it were not for the old captain's living support, he would probably have decayed into a dilapidated household. Zhao Xi pondered that it was not a big deal, let alone the various figures he needed to gather at the moment, so he took note of this matter in his heart. In the blink of an eye, the sky darkened, and music came with the wind from the distant Fan Lu. Although it was only curling, it was also smooth. However, it was then covered up by the noise on the Bian River, which was a different kind of atmosphere, making Zhao Xi's mind rise with the idea of taking a walk to the Zhou Bridge. As soon as he stepped out of the pear-blossom wooden door in the main hall, the housekeeper Zhou from the mansion rushed over and crossed his hand to announce that the palace commander, Captain Gao, had brought something. Zhao Xi's heart was clear. He asked someone to lift it up and see, but it was only a few boxes of silver, about 10,000 taels. He knew that Gao Qiu had learned about today's situation, and although he couldn't express much resentment in his heart, he still brought the compensation money and couldn't help but sneer twice. Standing with his hands down and looking at the box for a while, Zhao Xi called Lei San and said, "Go to the education department and call Qi Hongyu over." In less than half an hour, a young lady entered the royal mansion. Her skin was as smooth as cream, her face was like peach blossoms, her fine eyebrows and handsome eyes were slender, her figure was full, she was wearing a water powder skirt, and her mouth was filled with a smile. She said, "Young master, come find me." Zhao Xi's gaze turned around her and then said, "There's something you need to do. You don't need to follow the official path. You can go pick up the broken jade tower and set off tomorrow." Qi Hongyu was slightly surprised and said, "Please make it clear, young master." Zhao Xi tapped a few boxes of silver with his chin and said, "Go find someone in Tangyin County, Xiangzhou, and send these things to his house." Qi Hongyu glanced at the wooden box on the ground and said, "What person would you like to give it to, young master? Do you have a detailed address?" Zhao Xi thought for a moment and said, "Most likely it's a town or village below Tangyin County. This person is a young man named Yu Fei, who is about 2 or 3 years younger than me. He knows military tactics and is skilled in martial arts. His family should not be wealthy." Qi Hongyu nodded and said, "Young master, since you don't follow the official path, it may take some time to find this young man." Zhao Xi stretched lazily and looked at the bright moon in the air, saying calmly, "It doesn't matter. If I'm not mistaken, teacher Zhou Dong should also be there at this moment. It shouldn't be difficult to find it. When the things are sent, they will be split in half, with one for the Yu family and one for teacher Zhou Dong. If the teacher is not there, they will all be left at the Yu family. Master Zhou is also there. Qi Hongyu heard this and her pupils slightly contracted. She lowered her head and said, "Red fish knows. Red fish is going to prepare now." Zhao Xi saw that her expression was slightly nervous and smiled. "Why don't you ask why someone else is not sent for this kind of thing, and instead let your little lady be the head?" Qi Hongyu said, "I believe the young master has his own reasons." Zhao Tandao said, "The lady of the Yu family is a heroine among women. She is loyal and courageous, and will never accept gold and silver without reason. As a woman, you are always more talkative than those rough men." Qi Hongyu thought thoughtfully and said, "Please teach me, young master." Zhao Xi shook his head and said, "You are also a smart person. How can I still teach you this kind of thing? It's always a gift from my senior brother to my junior brother. If you still refuse to accept it, then speak up with righteousness and ask her if the Yu family has a loyal heart to serve the country. If so, how can the country show no signs of it? Let's say that I have high expectations for this junior brother." Qi Hongyu said, "I understand." Zhao Xi sighed lightly and said, "Although his words may not be straightforward, they can only be so. If you see teacher Zhou Dong and talk to me again, I miss him very much." Qi Hongyu bowed again, and then Lei San summoned the guards to secretly transport several boxes out of the Qi prince's mansion. End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Reception in the front hall. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Reception in the front hall. After this incident, Zhao Xi no longer had the intention of going to Zhouqiao. He wandered around in the mansion, feeling 1,000 twists and turns in his heart. Since he traveled through this era and learned about his identity and background, he has been silently planning. Starting from a young age, he wrote poetry at the age of 5, wrote lyrics at the age of 6, solved game theory at the age of 7, practiced martial arts at the age of 8, and wandered through the streets, relying on his identity to fight against injustice. I studied under Zhou Tong, and at the age of 12, I achieved success in martial arts. At 13, I made friends with courtiers. At 14, I secretly organized the Broken Jade Tower and formed a network of heroes from all over the world. At 16, I used all my means and was promoted to the position of Imperial Guard and military officer. As he walked step by step, he was meticulous, putting in a lot of effort, and even his whole person felt a bit numb. Zhao Xi returned to his study and opened a purple sandalwood box, which contained peach red Shuetao's notes, each with small characters and symbol drawings that he could only understand. This was a plan for the future. He sat upright in the chair, reached out for a small lamb hair, started writing, finished writing, threw it into the box, and then locked it with a snap. Then Zhao Xi collapsed into his chair, from top to bottom, as if he had no bones left. He fell asleep like this. He slept soundly, his dreams returned to his hometown, his pupils filled with memories, his summer camp at a tutoring class, by an unnamed lake, with long hair and yellow skirts, a beautiful round moon, short flutes and long flutes and flutes in the blink of an eye. About 10 days had passed. In the early morning of that day, Zhao Xi called for Lei San and handed over a letter, saying, "Send it to Huang Gu, the owner of the Broken Jade building. Ask him to send someone to quickly report it to Huang Ju, the pacifier of Fujian Road. We must keep it confidential. If it is not comprehensive, we should not let anyone see it if it is destroyed." Lei San was ordered to leave, but when he turned around, he was stopped by Zhao Xi and said, "Go to the building and have Jian Sui investigate the past of several sons of Gao Qiu's family. Report any dirty matters together." Lei San was taken aback by the words and thought for a moment, saying, "You don't need to ask Jian Vexia about this matter, my subordinate will know a rough idea. Gao Qiu doesn't have many sons, he only has one adopted son, who is the cousin of his adoptive uncle's family. He is called Gao Kenshi, but the people of Tokyo don't like him. They call him Hua Hua Tai Sui, also known as Gao Yanei." Upon hearing this, Zhao Xi's eyebrows furrowed slightly. He supported the table with his palm and leaned forward slightly, saying, Lei San, what did you say? Didn't Gao Qiu have 3 sons, and the 2 sons were officials? Xiao Xianggong, Lei San scratched his head and said softly, Gao Qiu has no children under his knee. Many people know about this matter, even the people in the city have heard of it. Gao Qiu was a close aide to the official family when they were hiding. It was expected that Xiao Xianggong was not unfamiliar, but how could he forget it? Zhao Xi is no stranger, it's just his past life memories. History records that Gao Qiu had 3 sons, which is definitely not wrong. Even if it is wrong, it will only be more or less. Therefore, he had a preconceived understanding of Gao Qiu's family affairs and never thoroughly investigated them. Zhao Xi looked at Lei San expressionlessly. Lei San was born and raised in Tokyo, and although he was a local snake, he had a bit of chivalrous heart. He accidentally killed someone on the wrong side of the road and was imprisoned. After being rescued by Zhao Xi, he remained loyal for a while. Zhao Xi slowly said, Gao Qiu has no children, only his adopted son Gao Kansas. He is the cousin of the adoptive uncle's family. Lei San's heart was furrowed by Zhao Xi's gaze, and he gritted his head and said, but it's like this. I absolutely dare not deceive you in this kind of matter, and although Gao Kan belongs to my cousin, there are rumors that he was born to Gao Qiu's aunt when he was young, so he disregarded his ethics. Zhao Xi's face was strange, and after a while, he let out his breath and waved his hand, saying, you go ahead and let this matter go. Lei San left with a mist all over his head, leaving Zhao Xi alone in the study. He was stunned for a moment before muttering to himself, it's not right in the end. Why is that so? At this moment, a butler suddenly came to report that someone outside the mansion had submitted a petition for worship. Zhao Xi ordered the butler to bring over the post and open it. It turned out that it was the old captain mentioned by Duke Mi who had arrived. He then ordered the butler to spread the word and arranged to meet in the front hall. There are generally 3 places in the Wang mansion where guests can be seen, namely the front, middle, and back halls. However, it cannot be said that there is a preference for one over the other, but the relationship between relatives and acquaintances is different, and there are differences in distance. The front hall is the place where guests can be seen, while the middle hall is accessible to confidants. As for the back hall, only relatives will be able to visit. Previously, the hall was quite large, but the interior was also magnificent. After Zhao Xi had made 2 small dragon balls, the butler quickly introduced the 2 people. One of them trembled and trembled, old and withered, leaning on a bird's rod in his hand, resembling an old man. He wore a large red Sichuan brocade robe, but the surface of the garment was wrinkled, and at first sight, it was something pressing down on the bottom of the box. The other person was a young man, only 13 or 14 years old when he saw his appearance. Although he had an ordinary appearance, his waist was firm and his legs were stable, and his eyes were bright. In Zhao Xi's eyes, he naturally saw that he had learned how to wield guns and sticks, and had some foundation. The old man's eyes were clouded as he watched a person sitting on a chair in front of him, dressed in a young silver robe and with a dusty aura. He became somewhat excited and shook off the arms supported by the young man, leaning over to bow down. He shouted, previously, I would like to pay my respects to the Grand Commandant Hong Xian in front of the palace and pay my respects to His Highness the Prince of Qi. Zhao Xi had read the letter of Duke Mi and knew that the old man surnamed Hong in front of him, the Grand Preceptor in front of the palace, was not holding the rank of Grand Preceptor, otherwise he would not have fallen into poverty here. He gestured to support the old captain and said, I'm sorry. There's no need for such etiquette. The old captain should sit down and speak quickly. Accompanied by the old captain sitting on the chair, the young man saw Dali again in front of him. Zhao Xi smiled and said, but he has a heroic demeanor on his face. The young man was shy and hesitant, not knowing how to respond. He was so angry that the old captain slammed his cane, but almost knocked off the bird's head at the head of the battle. He also realized that Zhao Xi was by his side and couldn't help but plead guilty. After drinking the little dragon ball, the old captain was filled with emotion and said that Emperor Huizong once rewarded 5 cakes, which cannot be forgotten today. Zhao Xi smiled and said that there were still many inside the mansion. When he left, he also took 5 cakes. The old captain burst into tears upon hearing this. Zhao Xi advised and chatted with the old captain about the past of Emperor Huizong's reign. Suddenly, he mentioned Duke Mi. The old captain said that Mi Jinting was skilled in martial arts, proficient in firearms and sticks, not inferior to Li Xian, and when it comes to longevity, Li Xian was far from flattering. Zhao Xi heard the words and said strangely, but Li Xian, the godfather of Tong Daofu. The old captain said, it is this person who is not only skilled in leading troops, but also has unparalleled martial arts skills. Mi Jinting must not be weaker than him. Zhao Tandao said, I have heard of Duke Mi practicing martial arts, but I didn't expect him to be so powerful. Li Xian was invincible in the northern region back then, so in recent years, Duke Mi has been acting clumsily. The old captain said, Mi Jinting doesn't like the court. Although he had a reputation back then, decades have passed and no one has spread it, so it has not been passed down. Zhao Ji nodded and looked at the young man behind the old captain. This young man was the great-grandson of the old captain, named Xianyang, ranking 7th among his peers. This time, the old captain gave up his face and came to Tokyo to seek a background for this great-grandson. Zhao Ji said, Xianyang, let me ask you, how is your martial arts? The young man blushed and said, speaking to King Qi, an ordinary person can withstand 10 unbeaten enemies. Zhao Xi clapped his hands and said, Miao Yi, you are already a captain of 10. However, I don't want you to join the Forbidden Army. I want you to be my personal follower first. Would you be willing to do so? End of this chapter. Chapter 6. Surprisingly, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6. Surprisingly, Hong Xianyang didn't know what he meant to follow personally, so he immediately sneaked his eyes to look at the old captain. The old captain also had some soul in his heart upon hearing this. His great-grandson Hong Qi was the only descendant in the family who could make a move. He came to Tokyo this time with the intention of obtaining a background in the imperial army. After all, he was not proficient in literature, but his martial arts were still decent. Unexpectedly, the king of Qi wanted to take him as his personal companion. He couldn't distinguish what Zhao Xi meant at this moment, but he still knew about his worldly wisdom for many years. He quickly spoke up, I don't want to thank His Highness the King of Qi. After Hong Xianyang thanked him, Zhao Tami said, the Forbidden Army is not as good as before. Otherwise, let you join the army. Being my personal follower has its own benefits, and in the future, you will know it yourself. The old captain and his grandson naturally agreed, and Zhao Xi said again, the old captain has come from Junzhou. If he doesn't want to return, he can rent a separate courtyard near this mansion, which is also convenient for Xianyang to take care of. The expenses during this period can be counted in the account of the royal family. The old captain was immediately overjoyed. He was already over 90 years old, and this time he left home, he carried the idea of no longer living and looking back at those cowardly younger generations. Even if he died, he would die in Kaifeng Prefecture in Tokyo. He couldn't help but say, oh, and want to thank him. Zhao Xi refused to let him bow down. With a helping, he suddenly thought of something and fell silent. For some reason, the grandparents and grandchildren dared not speak recklessly. The old one only poured the tea soup from the little dragon ball into his stomach, while the young one lowered his head and dared not move. Zhao Xi pinched the bowing post on the table, his brows gradually furrowed, and suddenly said, Old Grand Commandant, big name Hong Xian. The old captain didn't know what was going on, so he agreed and just stared blankly. Zhao Xi sat on the chair, straightened himself, took a deep breath, and said, during the reign of Emperor Huizong, could there be a major outbreak of the epidemic? The old captain's turbid eyes opened and closed, and he trembled as he touched his grey beard. His face showed a look of nostalgia, and he said for a long time, "If your highness asks about something else, it may be forgotten, but this matter should be remembered." Zhao Xi said, "But why? Please explain it in detail." The old captain said, "That great epidemic is rare, affecting the capital and causing great damage to the military and civilians. The officials implemented benevolent policies, exempted taxes, and granted amnesty to the world, but unexpectedly, the epidemic was still difficult to control." Zhao Tammy said, "So what should we do?" The old captain shook his head and said, "If that's all, I may not remember all of it. It's just that the officials once sent me to Longhu Mountain to pray for Master Zhang to ward off this epidemic. The journey was bumpy, and Master Zhang went to the capital to apply magic and medicine, treat diseases and save people. That's not to forget." Upon hearing this, Zhao Xi stood up straight and walked back and forth in the hall. After a moment, he said, "Didn't the old captain encounter anything strange on Mount Longhu?" Upon hearing these words, the old captain trembled all over and his face froze. After a while, he let out a bitter smile and said, "Decades have passed, and some words are difficult to hold in my heart. Now I am not afraid of your highness blaming me. I have never told anyone about this matter, and always suspect that the Taoist priest on the mountain is playing tricks on me. However, after careful consideration, it is not like this. There is no answer left or right, and after decades of suffering, there is no one to say." Zhao Xi suddenly stopped and turned his head to look, "Let's talk and listen." The old captain pondered for a few moments and said, "I went to the mountain to invite the Heavenly Master. Unexpectedly, the Heavenly Master had already understood my purpose and went to the capital alone. I was entertained by the Taoist and visited many scenic spots. At the end of the right corridor in the palace on the mountain, there was a demon-subduing hall covered with a cover. The Taoist said that the demon king was locked inside. I was curious for a moment and relied on power to order someone to uncover the cover and dig down the stone tablets and turtles inside." Zhao Xi said, "Is there any character on the stone tablet?" The old captain exclaimed, "Ah," and stood up with his cane. "The strange thing is here. The monument is actually engraved with the 4 big characters, encounter a flood and open, as if waiting for me to open it. Later, I became even bolder and lifted the stone slab of the cellar below. Your Highness, guess what?" Zhao Xi had a dark face and didn't speak, just taking a deep breath. The old captain looked at himself and said, "I only heard the sound of thunder shaking, the earth shaking and the mountains shaking, and saw the black smoke rolling and rushing towards the outside of the hall. It really scared me and left me stunned. I was at a loss and ran away. When I met the abbot who explained everything in detail, the Taoist blamed me for opening the seal that suppressed many generations without authorization and letting go of more than 100 demons from the heavenly gang and earthly demons. I was very scared, so I quickly packed my luggage, led the servants, and returned to the capital from the mountain." The young man was also surprised and said, "Isn't there really such a thing as a demon god?" The old captain shook his head and said, "I really don't know. Later on, when I thought about it carefully, I was afraid that the Taoist would play tricks on me. It's just that the 4 characters on the stone tablet that were opened and encountering a flood are always difficult to figure out." At this moment, Zhao Xi's heart was not calmer than that of the old captain. It was as if he had disrupted the river and sea. He had traveled through 16 years, carefully planned and worked step by step, thinking to himself that there were no major mistakes or omissions. However, he never thought that song was still the same song, and how could the water margin still be mixed in? No wonder in recent years he has often had strange feelings in his heart, always feeling that something is wrong. In the past 2 or 3 years, he has also heard about the reputation of some people in the Green Forest. However, he thinks that some people always have their own reputation, not just fabricated, but just because there are more people and fewer people, he has not thought about the water margin. And there is only one person like Gao Qiu, who came from the water margin. That's why I met him at the Yu temple a few days ago. Zhao Xi couldn't help but mutter to himself, isn't it that Lin Chong couldn't succeed? He suddenly remembered something and quickly walked out of the room shouting, where is Su Shi? Su Shi was the commander of the royal palace's guards, under the command of the imperial Long Ji, occupying the imperial army's establishment. Zhao Xi called him to inquire about Lin Chong. In no time, a thin and tall man ran over and Zhao Tammy said, can you recognize the instructor in the Forbidden Army? Su Shi said, if you don't know me, there will always be people who know me. I don't know what Zhao Xiangdong's mission is. Zhao Jidao said, there is a spear instructor in the Forbidden Army, who is so full of leopard heads and eyes. He calls himself Lin Chong and goes to ask how things are at present. Su Shi responded and turned around to leave, but was unexpectedly stopped. Zhao Xi said again, by the way, I'll inquire where his house is. It's safe to come back and report. Su Shifeng and Hua left, and Zhao Xi returned to the front hall to look at the old and young people with big and small eyes. He couldn't help but laugh and say, it's nothing serious. The old captain can explain in more detail about Longhu Mountain. As soon as they spoke, it was already noon. The king's mansion had arranged meals, entertained the elderly and children, and gave them copper coins and silver as gifts. They instructed to arrange a place to stay before continuing their conversation. The two of them left the mansion grateful for their kindness. Not long after, Su Shi returned to the mansion and reported that Lin Chong had offended Captain Gao for some reason, and had been falsely accused with the intention of causing death. Fortunately, Kaifeng Prefecture still held some conscience, but in the end, he was sent to Cangzhou and set off yesterday. Zhao Xi nodded and secretly said, do you know where Lin Chong's family is? Su Shidao said, I have inquired carefully, but it is not difficult to find. Zhao Xi walked a few steps in the hall after hearing this, and suddenly remembered Gaoya. He called out that it was not appropriate and said, point a few people, you lead the way, go to Lin Chong's house and take a look. Su Shidao said, does Zhao Xiangdong ride a bike or a horse? Zhao Xi said, where do you come from with so many noisy words? Just hold the shining night jade lion. Su Shi pleaded guilty and left, while Zhao Xi went straight to the door of the mansion. End of this chapter. Chapter 7. Without killing, it's hard to piece the heart. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7. Without killing, it's hard to piece the heart. The horse was not fast and had to avoid pedestrians and vehicles. After passing through the market, it crossed several main roads and rode a few horses to a green brick alley entrance. Su Shidao said, Zhao Xiangdong, the second to last household inside is the Lin Chong family. Zhao Xi nodded and rode away, only to see a commotion outside the courtyard. It turned out that several men with broad backs and waists were subduing an old man. Although the old man is old, he can still see that his qi and blood are still strong. At this moment, his face is flushed, his angry eyes are wide open, like a forced and embarrassed beast, and his voice is hoarse and roaring, how dare you do this in broad daylight? How dare you do this? Teacher Zhang, please be calm and don't be impatient. There was a person next to the old man, of middle age, with a fair face and no beard. He wore a 10,000-character scarf on his head and a soap gauze back, smiling and comforting. Lu Qian, you despicable and treacherous scoundrel, who has harmed his friends. Now that you have assisted the tyrant, are you not afraid of retribution? The old man cursed. Pa! Another person rushed out next to the old man, but he was a short and chubby figure, not very old, wearing a hat crookedly. He reached out his hand and slapped the old man, saying randomly, being the father. In law and the yamen is not better than being the poor and poor instructor. He is so old that he doesn't know how to stand up. Grandpa, I will wake you up today. The old man was a bit confused after taking a bite, but he didn't recognize the person. He could only curse and then suffered a few more harsh blows, and blood immediately flowed from the corner of his mouth. Zhao Xi had already heard the conversation and watched this scene. Ma jumped down close and said coldly, "Take all of them. Those who refuse will be killed." Su Shi and several guards immediately pulled out their single swords and rushed forward. The group of people did not know what had happened, and Lu Qian's expression changed. He bowed and said, "Everyone, we are." Before he could finish speaking, he was slapped in the face with a flat knife by Su Shi, and suddenly shouted, "Kill me too," as he leaned back. Zhao Xi didn't look at him either, and walked straight towards the wooden door of the small courtyard. However, the short and chubby young man intercepted him and exclaimed, "You're so brave to rush into handling affairs in the yamen. Have you asked me if Fuan is here?" Zhao Xi paused and said, "Are you Fuan?" The short and chubby young man was waiting to answer, but to his surprise, Zhao Xi kicked him heartily, causing his front to hit his back and shattering the 5 organs temple inside. After spitting out a few pieces of minced meat, he remained motionless. Zhao Xi walked into the courtyard, but in front of him was a house with a 4-courtyard. He walked a few steps into it, only to hear a sound coming from inside the main room. But what was heard was the voice of the yamen, who said, "Since he wrote the letter of divorce, he has lost his connections. Why do you think you are lowly? Just follow me, with luxurious clothes, jade food, gold, silver, and silk. Aren't you happy?" The little girl's voice was mournful. "If it weren't for you and other villains pressuring you, how could this be so?" The yamen laughed and said, "Madam, I'm sorry to see that saving me is not all for the sake of madam, even the iron and stone man can be turned around." The young lady said, "Even if I die, I won't comply." The yamen angrily said, "I'm afraid I won't even be able to die then." Zhao Xi frowned and walked closer. He got up and broke through the door, only to see that it was a suite. Inside, the little lady was crying and dodging, with one leg limping and leaning on a cane. Her evil form was threatening each other. Hearing the door shatter, the yamen suddenly cursed, "Where did you come from? How dare you harm your grandfather's good deeds?" Zhao Xi walked forward expressionless, and the yamen suddenly panicked. He threw away his cane in his hand, but he couldn't stand steadily anymore. He knelt down with a plop sound, unsure of how to say anything, but kowtowed and begged for mercy. Zhao Xi glanced at the little girl and she retreated to the wall with a thumping. She didn't know where the courage came from and wept, saying, "It's all said to be a peaceful world. Why do tigers and wolves run rampant, falsely accuse and convict, and force good people? Is this world just a facade?" Zhao Xi was dumbfounded and didn't go to see her. Instead, he looked at the yamen and said, "Gao Kansas. Your Highness, 1,000 years old, please spare your life." At this moment, the yamen was speechless, pouring out all the lyrics from both the singing book and the theater, hoping to survive. Zhao Xi looked at him and said, "There are so many people like you in the world nowadays. In fact, if I really want to kill them, I won't be able to finish them all." The inside of the yamen heard nothing but a turning point and said, "Oh my goodness. Your Highness, due to my father's love for the official residence, I have spared the little one. The little one is willing to repay the king as an ox and a horse." Zhao Xi's eyes slightly opened and closed, and suddenly said to the young lady, "And close your eyes." How could the little lady be willing? She just blinked her tearful eyes and looked into the field, as if stars were twinkling sadly. Zhao Xi saw her stubbornness and didn't take care of her anymore. Instead, he looked at the yamen and sighed slightly, "Gao Kan, I really can't kill all the villains in this world, but for you. I feel aggrieved if I don't kill you." "Ah, Your Highness." Upon hearing this, the yamen suddenly panicked and wanted to crawl away, but one leg was still broken and unable to withstand a big movement. Zhao Xi's sleeve flashed with a cold light and a short sword slid out like a silver snake, piercing directly into the heart of the yamen. Blood flowed down the groove of the sword and instantly flowed all over the ground. The body of the yamen collapsed, and the little girl next to her let out an exclamation of surprise. Her body was already half soft, leaning against the wall and trembling slightly. Zhao Xi took his sword and walked over, saying, "We can't stay here anymore." Xiaonyang couldn't say anything more. Zhao Xi said again, "Come with me first, I'll make arrangements." The little lady's face was pale and she remained silent. Zhao Xi sighed and said, "Gao Qiu knows about this matter and will definitely come to investigate. You won't be able to argue in 100 words. Even if you do, why would that guy come to me? He's just using you to make up for it." The young lady regained her senses and sobbed, "I am not afraid of death. If the officials are framed, it may be difficult for them to escape death. I will also die. Follow him." Zhao Xi glanced at the 3-foot white silk that had already been placed on the table and shook his head. "It doesn't matter if you die, but what about your old father? When I first came in, he was already taken by the people of the palace commander's mansion. If you die again, he will fight against it. I'm afraid you will be cut to pieces and the capital will be destroyed." The young lady burst into tears upon hearing this, and Zhao Tammy said, "Come with me. Let's first reunite your father and daughter, and we'll talk about other matters later." The young lady said, "Is there any deception?" Zhao Xi shook his head and said, "You know who I am, how could that be? Let's leave quickly, otherwise it will be difficult for another person from the palace commander's mansion to come and end." Watching the little lady's footsteps move, Zhao Xi breathed a sigh of relief in his heart. He did this without any planning, just for the sake of a surge of anger in his heart. He killed and killed, without further ado. Stepping out of the courtyard, I saw that Su Shi had already taken control of the people in the palace commander's mansion. Lu Qian was lying on the ground, Fuan was dead, and Coach Zhang was just stunned. Su Shidao said, "Xiaoxiangong, can these people be sent to Kaifeng Prefecture?" Zhao Xi said, "What kind of nonsense are you talking about? How can I handle the matter with that government office? Let's go back to the government and discuss it." At this moment, the young lady came out and saw teacher Zhang. Father and daughter hugged their heads and cried bitterly. Zhao Xi glanced at him and said, "Don't do it, teacher. Let's go with me and save your life first." After all, Coach Zhang was a person who had seen the world before. Seeing that the Yamen had not yet come out, there was still a person who died suddenly in front of him. He had already figured out a rough idea in his heart and prostrated himself, saying, "It's all up to your grace's orders." Zhao Xi ordered someone to support him and said, "Sushi, take the instructor and go back to the mansion now." End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Yanfu Palace. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8. Yanfu Palace. As everyone mounted their horses, Zhao Xi said to the young lady, "Can you handle it?" The little lady shook her head, and Zhao Xi stopped speaking. She flipped over and lightly poked her hand, then lifted the little lady and placed her horizontally in front of her. The horse ran up and down, bumpy and bumpy. The little lady was unwilling to do so. She felt ashamed and resentful, struggling incessantly. Zhao Yue frowned and said lightly, "Calm down." The young lady was annoyed by his impoliteness and exerted even more force. Zhao Xi no longer paid attention, but drove forward, raising dust all the way, and headed straight. Seeing people and horses walking away, Lu Qian rolled up from the ground and shouted, "There's a disaster. If we don't come out of the Yamen yet, we're afraid we'll be in trouble." Several big men also looked flustered and at a loss. Lu Qian's eyes turned and he said, "Wait and see, I'll go in and see what to do." In no time, Lu Qian ran out of the house and shouted, "Indeed, the Yamen has been brutally killed. You guys are here to guard. When I return to the mansion and report to the captain, you cannot leave without authorization." A few people agreed, and Lu Qian quickly walked out of the alley, then hurriedly took a shortcut back home. He packed up some gold and silver and told the old servant a few idle words. Then he picked up a bundle with a stick and headed straight for the south gate of Tokyo. After leaving the gate, he ran all the way without looking back. Zhao Tammy returned to the mansion and called for 2 maids to settle the young lady. The young lady was unwilling to do anything, but Coach Zhang repeatedly urged her to do so. He only requested to go to the coach's house to bring his personal maid Gina, and Zhao Tammy sent someone to handle it. This matter came to an end, but the coach didn't dare to go back to live, so he had no choice but to take a temporary rest in the mansion. Let's talk about the few big men guarding the Lin family courtyard, waiting left and right. After an hour or two, they didn't see Lu Qian and his people return. Someone said, "Isn't it that Ho Lu Yu quietly ran away and left us here to take responsibility?" Someone woke up and said, "Yes, it is. Today's matter is led by Marquis Lu Yu and Fuan. Now that the Yaman is dead, he is afraid that the captain will question him, so he ran away to avoid punishment." Another person said, "What should we do then? I can't wait any longer than that, Lu Qian. I just listened to the order, and there are elderly and young people at home. Where can we run? It's better to go back and report to the captain as soon as possible." A few big men left one to guard, while the others hurriedly returned to report. But it was said that Captain Gao was not in the office at the moment, but drinking and having fun at home. There were 5 or 7 dishes, 3 or 2 bowls of soup, 2 pots of imperial wine rewarded by the government on the table. 2 concubines accompanied each other at the table, one playing the shiqin, and the other singing the beautiful Yang Luan Xiaofeng and Wanyue in white. It was really delightful. He had a broken household background, and even in his dreams, he never imagined his current glory. Although in recent years, the interest of the officials in playing kuju has greatly decreased, and even the Yuan society in the capital has been rarely mentioned. He only focuses on doting on Lin Lingsu and cultivating the elusive path, but he has taken a different path and recommended Li Shishir to the officials with Wang Yan. The officials are happy, and the 2 of them have also received many rewards. It's just that the eunuch Zhang Di is despicable. He accompanies every official who goes out of the palace, and in the end, he falls in love with both sides. I'm afraid that in the end, the official will only remember his good qualities and forget who first introduced this Li family. Gao Qiu drank so much that he wanted to get drunk, but he heard someone crying and reporting. Looking up, he recognized several of his own children's attendants, who were arranged by him and accounted for the salary of the Forbidden Army. Gao Qiu couldn't help but say, "What are you crying for? Where is Shirda child?" The several big men returned from Lin Chang's house to report the news. They had already made up their minds on the way, but knew that the other party was the king of Qi. They didn't dare to add insult to injury, but only wanted to speak fluently and smoothly. After a few words, Gao Qiu stayed on the spot. He only had Gao Can as his only son, but he was still born to an aunt who had committed adultery during his youth. Later, he was injured in a kuju game and became a 3rd wife and 4 concubines with weak intentions. He had no choice but to love this child in every way, even if he wanted to take over his wife and daughter, he still had to help him clean up. At this moment, Gao Qiu stood up abruptly and murmured to himself, "What's so much about this? What's so much about this?" The leader Han said again, "The body in the Yamen is still in the Lin family. Please make a decision, Captain." Gao Qiu's eyes were stunned, and suddenly he covered his chest with his hand and shouted, "It hurts so much." He collapsed backward straight. After having dinner, Zhao Xi suddenly remembered something. He called Su Shi and said, "There is a vegetable garden in the Daxiangguo temple on the wall between the Yu temple. Inside, there is a vegetable head monk named Lu Zhishan. Please send someone to search for him. If you find him, bring him to see me." Su Shi was ordered to leave, and Zhao Xi went to the pavilion in the flower garden. After sitting down, he couldn't be at ease in his thoughts. If the world really depended on the water margin, wouldn't it be some divine and demonic things? He firmly believed it, but at the moment, it couldn't be verified unless he personally went to Longhu Mountain to see what the so-called demon suppression hall looked like. Just as he was thinking in his heart, suddenly a butler reported an event, saying that someone from the palace would come to see him. Zhao Xi knew that it was an incident within the Gao government office, so he went to see the palace attendant. However, he recognized him and called him Zheng Fu. He had also served him for a period of time when he lived in the imperial city before. Zhao Xi said, but Gao Qiu went to file a lawsuit. Zheng Fudao said, the second prince had a good prediction. Captain Gao was crying and didn't have any handsome appearance. He hugged the official's leg and said a bunch of miscellaneous words. Zhao Xi said, but is it arranged for me? Zheng Fudao said, but there are also some, but more of them are just complaints. After talking about these many years of old things, even the officials feel a sense of sadness when they hear about them. Zhao Xi stopped speaking and followed Zheng Fu out of the palace, taking a car into the imperial city. In this dynasty, Emperor Daojun enjoyed extravagance, and after ascending to the extreme, he found the original palace in the imperial city narrow, so he expanded the Yanfu Palace. This palace was led by Kai Jing to flatter, and 5 eunuchs including Tong Guan, Ong Jian, Jia Xiang, He Su, and Lan Songxi were summoned to supervise the construction. A vast palace, you strive for wonders, I strive for excellence, extravagant and prosperous, disregarding work and wealth. The halls and pavilions are continuous, with pools carved into the sea and springs drawn into the lake. Truly, bronze sculptures such as literary birds and strange beasts are in various forms, with beautiful and famous trees, strange rocks and secluded rocks, and extremely unique. Zhao Xi and Zheng Fu entered the imperial city and headed straight for this palace. After passing through the Chenxi gate to the east, Zhao Xi asked, which hall is the official family in? There are 9 main halls, dozens of pavilions, flowing water, lakes, mountains, and stone fences in this Yanfu palace. If you are not familiar with them, you will get lost if you enter. Zheng Fudao said, the officials have instructed us to stay at the main hall of Yanfu and say that the 2 great kings will come and take us to move the Qingdian. Zhao Xi nodded at the words and said that the Qin Palace was where the official family practiced. In recent years, his father, the emperor, has spent most of his time there. At the entrance of the Qianqing Hall, Zheng Fu pleaded guilty and left. The 2 attendants in front of the door said, the officials have instructed that when the king of Qi arrives, he should go in directly. Zhao Xi said hello and looked at the window lattice of the main hall. Inside, there was a clear and hale figure, dressed in a long robe with large sleeves, seemingly dancing something. End of this chapter. Chapter 9. Emperor and Crown Prince. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9. Emperor and Crown Prince. Pushing the door open, cigarettes curled up and 108 candles were arranged in the main hall according to the Luo Tian formation. On the dome inside the hall, the stars of the heavens are outlined, and there are 18 golden pillars engraved with countless inscriptions. Even the painted gold bricks on the ground depict the mountains, rivers, seas, and the country. A person standing in the center of the hall, wearing a clear hibiscus crown on his head, wearing a light blue and white Taoist robe, holding a peach-wood magic sword in his hand, exudes a fairy-like demeanor and moral integrity, and is the emperor of the current dynasty. I saw Emperor Daojun with his eyes slightly closed, stepping on mysterious steps at his feet, wielding his wooden sword gently, and uttering strange syllables while reciting words. Zhao Xi stood still, looking at the Emperor Huizong in later books. Suddenly, he thought of the famous line, Prince Duan is frivolous and cannot rule the world. He sighed in his heart. About half a quarter of an hour later, Emperor Daojun stopped and Zhao Tankai said, Daddy, the child is here. Emperor Daojun opened his eyes, looked at him up and down, and slowly said, Second brother, you did a good job. Zhao Xi showed surprise, frowned and pondered for a moment before saying, I don't know what Dad said, isn't it? Isn't it the person that the child killed today? That's the villain who forcibly robbed the daughter of the people. Emperor Daojun looked at him with bright eyes and said, Second brother, to be honest. Zhao Xi suddenly showed a bitter smile and bowed, saying, Dad has achieved great cultivation, but he was seen through at first glance. The child admired him, but today that person competed with the child for a young lady. It's okay, but he cursed the child and insulted the previous emperors. This is absolutely intolerable, and even killed him by mistake. Emperor Daojun nodded and showed an expression that he had known before, saying, "But you have never liked women, so why are you today?" Zhao Jidao said, "My child just doesn't like those elegant buildings and water-like places. This little girl is happy to see them, otherwise my child wouldn't have done such a thing that would be disrespectful to the royal family." Emperor Daojun said, "Since you are delighted with that little girl, it is also a reason to hold on, but do you know that the person who killed her is the only heir of Gao Qiu?" Zhao Xi was stunned and said, "I don't know. I used to see Gao Qiu when I was young, and I haven't heard of any children. Otherwise, I would have asked a few questions." Emperor Daojun said, "It's not your fault. Few people know the details about it. Poor Gao Qiu, the only heir, has also gone. Second brother, what should we do about this?" Zhao Xi hurriedly said, "What advice a child can make is entirely up to their father's decision." Emperor Daojun shook his head and started walking with his wooden sword. Zhao Xi stood still, just waiting quietly. After a moment, Emperor Daojun stopped and said, "Second brother, you have been intelligent since childhood, capable of both literature and martial arts. Why haven't you been interested in this position?" Zhao Xi thought for a moment and said, "With my older brother around, I naturally feel at ease. If it doesn't work out, there will still be 3 brothers around." Emperor Daojun said, "Do you really think so? When I first made my eldest brother the crown prince, there were many actions on my side, but you had no desires or requests, and in the end, the empress even came to ask me." Zhao Xi bowed and smiled. The empress always thinks too much, but she doesn't know that the child is determined to be Zhou Gongdan. Emperor Daojun squinted his eyes and said, "Did your second brother really decide to become the Duke of Zhou? Even if he wants me to be the Imperial Guard, he doesn't have any other ideas?" Zhao Tamarisk said, "I'm sure that as for the crown prince, it's my father's the final say to choose the right one. What I want to do is to strengthen the Forbidden Army and recover the 16 states of Yanyan for my father." Emperor Daojun remained silent, holding a wooden sword and starting to walk again. Zhao Xi lowered his head and remained silent. Emperor Daojun did not like Zhao Huan, but although this great prince had poor talent and abilities, he was not very wrong. He was also the eldest son, and according to the law of etiquette, he naturally wanted to establish a crown prince. Zhao Xi knew that in the face of propriety and law, the third prince Zhao Kai could not compete with Zhao Huan. Even with the support of Kai Jing, Gao Qiu, and others, even if he did not elect the legitimate, Zhao Huan was right, so Zhao Kai's chances were not high. If there were no Jingkong later, when Emperor Daojun was old and even more incompetent, he would not have been able to depose the crown prince, but now he would not have done so. Besides, there's also him in the middle. But he doesn't have many ideas about this mess, it's not about his skills. He's already rotten from top to bottom, who can build a tower out of thin air. As the saying goes, the current situation can only break through an old world and save the country with weapons and knives. If the officials are rotten, they will smash the yamen. If the Forbidden Army rots, cut off its roots. If the court is rotten, overthrow it all. Second brother, Emperor Daojun turned around and said, "Do you really have the ambition to recover Yanyan?" Zhao Xi said, "May I make up for my father's regret?" Daojun said, very good, very good. You go ahead and don't worry about Gao Qiu's matter. I will compensate him on my own." Zhao Xi bowed and said, "Daddy, I have one more thing. Now that the world is peaceful, it all depends on Daddy's good governance. I want to go to Longhu Mountain in Xinzhou to pray for Daddy and Empress." Emperor Daojun was puzzled and said, "Second brother, now that I am the leader of the Shenshao sect, why should I go to worship the dragon in Tiger Mountain?" Zhao Jidao said, "This is a wish that children have had since childhood, thinking that filial piety is complete. Now that children are serving in court, we should fulfill this wish. Upon hearing this, Emperor Daojun was overjoyed and said, "Your second brother is indeed filial. When you go, there will be more ceremonial guards. Don't be underestimated by the real people of Longhu Mountain." Zhao Xi said goodbye and walked out of Yanfu Palace all the way. He walked through the east gate of the imperial city, but before he reached the gate, someone behind him suddenly shouted, "When will my second brother enter the palace? Why don't you go to my brother's place to reminisce about the past?" Zhao Xi turned around and saw a blue and splendid attire, a white jade belt and a somewhat emaciated appearance. It was the Crown Prince Zhao Huan, and he couldn't help but salute, saying, "So it was my elder brother. My father invited me into the palace to reprimand him, so I haven't gone to pay my respects to him, even to the empress." Zhao Huan was surprised and said, "I haven't gone to the empress's place either. I think second brother is feeling very depressed. I wonder what mistake he made." Zhao Xi sighed and said, "I killed Gao Qiu's son. Dad said Gao Qiu only has that one descendant." Zhao Huan was taken aback for a moment, looked at the empty space nearby, and suddenly pulled Zhao Xi to a loft. He clapped his hands and smiled, saying, "Well done, well done. Gao Qiu has been a troublemaker for me since I was young, and now he is even more involved with Kai Jing. Don't think I don't know, they all support the mistress." Zhao Xi pretended for a moment and said, "Big brother, why do you need to tell me these things?" Zhao Huan coughed lightly and said, "I know my second brother has no intention of holding the position of crown prince, so I said so." Zhao Xi chuckled inwardly and said, "Since that's the case, I just told my father that I want to be the Duke of Zhou and reclaim the 16 states of Yan and Yun, which is my wish." Zhao Huanli showed surprise on his face, but quickly concealed it and patted his hand, saying, "I didn't expect second brother to have such a wish. I really admire it. If second brother comes to my place to drink someday." Zhao Xi responded and the two parted ways. As they walked a little further away, Zhao Xi suddenly turned back and said, "Big brother, I heard that my third brother has been studying hard lately and said he wants to hide his identity and take the top scorer exam." After he finished speaking, he left, leaving only Zhao Huan standing in place with a gradually gloomy expression. End of this chapter. Chapter 10. Meeting for the opening of government offices. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10. Meeting for the opening of government offices. Zhao Tami returned to his mansion without saying a word for a night. After a few days, the Ministry of Revenue finally removed the official office of the Imperial Guard, but it was also in the eastern city, not far from the Wang Mansion. Zhao Xi took someone to take care of it first, adjusted it according to his own thoughts, and arranged flowers, plants, and trees. This also delayed some time, so he chose an auspicious day and summoned his subordinates to discuss. The various armies under the jurisdiction of the Palace Front Department and the Imperial Guard Private Military Department were originally different, but the Imperial Guard Private Military Department did not have a commanding officer for many years, so they were all dominated by the Palace Front Department. Now, the Yamen has been reopened, and for a time, the lower echelons are crowded with people. Led by the respective Marquis of the Mabu army, there were also military supervisors, commanders, officials, and Mabu people who came to pay their respects, presenting their handbooks and announcing their names. After finishing the roll call, Zhao Xi saw that Zhang Cheng was missing from the instructor and knew that he must be the father of the young lady. He remained silent and only lectured. He knew that the imperial guards in the capital were seriously underhanded. In the past, the heads of these empty salaries were eaten by Gao Qiu. Now that he has taken up his post, according to the unwritten rules of the military, Gao Qiu should have secretly sent the account book of the empty salary quota. However, now it is obvious that he is deceiving him and not understanding it. Even before Gao's death, he did not see any action from Gao Qiu. This is not revenge, but rather an embarrassment to him from the beginning. Zhao Xi didn't point it out at this moment, but said, "Listen, all the generals. In the past, the Mabu two yamen were separated, without either the commander-in-chief or the marquis-in-chief, each acting independently. Now that the officials have reset their position as the military department, and the two are merged into one, there are many vacant positions. From top to bottom, they are all high-ranking officials. Nowadays, the biggest ones in your class are only the Marquis of Doyu in the Horse Army and the Marquis of Doyu in the Infantry Army. There is also a lack of commanders for both the Horse Army and the Infantry Army, as well as for both the Marquis of Doyu in the two armies and the Marquis of Doyu in the two armies. After calculation, it's really a big mess. As soon as Zhao Xi said these words, someone below immediately had their eyes lit up and their thoughts were stirring. Zhao Xi looked around and said with a smile, "In the past, you were oppressed by the palace magistrate, and everything you did was recorded on the head of the palace magistrate. Now, there is no need to worry. Since I have proposed this place, you should know who to prioritize." Immediately below, they spoke in unison and said, "Since the prince is the main one." Zhao Xi nodded and said, "There are many things that I won't talk about today. I'll leave some space for you to handle. Those who are close to the palace attendant can leave early, and I won't stop them either. But if you want to stay, you have to be half-hearted. Don't blame me for not caring about our relationship. Who dares to say no below? After all, the prince and the public are different, they belong to different families and have vacant positions for high-ranking officials. Even those who are close to Gao Qiu for a moment have directly decided to change their family." Zhao Xi asked about the situation in the army again, and these generals bravely answered some truth. Seeing that Zhao Xi only nodded, they unknowingly exposed the issue of empty pay. Zhao Xi didn't blame them either, he just asked them to go back and think carefully. If there was anything, they could go to the palace to see each other. These officers of the Forbidden Army are all veteran soldiers, and Zhao Xi's words are hard to tell. They all look at each other with their own plans in mind. Zhao Tammy knew that the Forbidden Army in the capital had already deteriorated to the extreme, and there was no stir in his heart. He only dismissed all the generals and went back to his mansion. He is different from Gao Qiu in that he is appointed as the commander of the Imperial Guards and the Imperial Household Department. Gao Qiu has the same title as the Grand Commandant of the three departments as the founding ceremony, so he must go to court. He can go to court or not. If there is a military or official call from the outside world, then he must go, otherwise he can completely wander to the end. After returning to the mansion, Lei San came to report that just now the young lady of the Zhang family came with her maid Jiner to express gratitude. Zhao Xi nodded and said, "Isn't he the little lady of the Lin family?" Lei San said, "Then Lin Chong wrote a divorce notice and sent it to the government office for filing. With no further involvement, she is no longer the young lady of the Lin family." Zhao Xi thought for a moment and said, "That's the same. Take me to see her." Lei San was ordered to lead the way to the front of the backyard and retreat, while a maid led him to a small courtyard. There is a loft on the second floor of the small courtyard, which is made of wood and elegant. There is a small garden next to the building, which is currently in spring. Flowers are blooming, competing for beauty, and butterflies are dancing and fragrant. Jiner stood in front of the courtyard door and saw a maid leading someone. Judging from her appearance, she knew it was the king of Qi from this mansion. She immediately panicked and after bowing, she wanted to go in and report, but was stopped by Zhao Xi waving her hand. He walked into the courtyard alone, only to see the little lady standing by the garden, staring blankly at the colorful flowers. After a moment of contemplation, Zhao Xidwan walked over and said, "Are you used to living here?" The little lady suddenly heard a man speak and couldn't help but let out an "oh." She lifted her skirt and was about to run into the building. However, after only 3 or 2 steps, she could distinguish Zhao Xi's voice. She then turned around with a red face and walked for 10,000 blessings, but remained silent. Zhao Shiqi said, "I heard from you that you went to thank me, but why are you not speaking at this moment? I asked if you are used to living here, and you didn't say anything." The little lady lowered her head and said, "I'm not used to it." Zhao Xi was puzzled and said, "Where are you not used to?" The young lady said, there is no such thing as being free and unrestrained in one's own home. Zhao Xi smiled and said, I know that's the truth, but right now you can't go back. Gao Qiu's only son has died. What kind of revenge is this? I think Coach Zhang has also told you that he is not an ordinary official. He has tens of thousands of forbidden soldiers under his command. Even if it's not easy to kill him, even if he assassinates your little girl, he's still easy to catch. The young lady said, I don't want to live anymore, and I'm not afraid he'll come and kill me. Zhao Tammy shook his head and said, where should we send it to the education department? The young lady said, I'm not afraid of death, so what? Zhao Xi smiled and said, what about the brothel? The little lady looked up at him and said, don't scare me. Zhao Ji sighed and said, you consider the peaceful world of Tokyo City, and now you have seen some things. It is common to say that a family was destroyed overnight, and there is something even worse that you don't know. It's okay in the mansion right now. Otherwise, if Gao Qiu causes trouble for you in a small courtyard, you probably wouldn't know when someone will be lost. The young lady said, how could this be? Our neighbors are not without widowed sisters, which one is as terrifying as you said? Zhao Xi shook his head and slowly walked to the garden, saying, they don't have these beautiful flowers. Why did you cause such trouble in the Gao government office? Don't you know it for yourself? The little lady's cheeks immediately turned red and she said, why are you talking nonsense? If you can't get used to living here, you just want to leave. Zhao Xi said, what's wrong with it? The young lady said, you have a noble status and there are many rules in this house. I can't bear to be constrained. Zhao Tammy said, where can we restrain ourselves? The young lady said, if I meet all the ladies in your family, I'm afraid I won't be able to defend myself, and it will be difficult to clear my name. Zhao Xi thought for a moment and said, in this mansion of Noah, besides the maids, you are the only young lady. Which other lady do you want to meet? After hearing this, the young lady paused for a moment and said with a few breaths, it's sad not to see the old things at home. Zhao Xi turned around and slowly walked outside, saying as he walked, this is easy to handle. I ordered someone to temporarily retrieve all those things and place them for you as before. You just need to stay there for a while. End of this chapter.